The office was quiet, almost eerily so, except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant tapping of keyboards. Sunlight poured in through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm glow across the modern, minimalistic workspace. She adjusted the cuff of her blouse nervously, aware that today would be different. Today, he was here, her late boss's best friend, the man whose presence she had only heard about in stories of laughter, business deals, and late-night confidences. Now he was standing in the middle of her office, exuding an effortless confidence that made her chest tighten and her thoughts scatter. He was older, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit that somehow made him look both authoritative and approachable at the same time. The way he leaned casually against her desk, one hand in his pocket, suggested a familiarity with power and the kind of charm that could disarm even the most composed person. His eyes, sharp, intelligent, and somehow piercing, met hers with a hint of curiosity, as if he could see right through her carefully constructed professional facade. She shifted slightly in her chair, feeling a mixture of nervousness and intrigue. It wasn't just his age or his experience that unsettled her. It was the way he carried himself, the way the office seemed to shrink around his presence, making her hyper-aware of every word she said, every gesture she made. He smiled faintly, a slow, knowing curve of his lips, and the room seemed to pulse with a subtle tension. There was history here, unspoken yet palpable, and she felt it tugging at the edges of her composure. He gestured toward a stack of files on her desk, moving with an easy grace that made the mundane act of handing over paperwork feel charged with significance. "I thought I'd come by to see how things were progressing," he said, his voice low and smooth, carrying just enough warmth to make her pulse quicken. She handed him the top file, and their fingers brushed briefly, a fleeting touch that sent an unexpected spark through her. She quickly withdrew her hand, telling herself it was purely accidental. Yet she couldn't ignore the sudden awareness of his presence, the subtle magnetism that seemed to draw her in despite her professional instincts. As he leaned slightly closer to examine the documents, she caught the faint scent of his cologne, a mix of cedarwood and something warm and intriguing that lingered in the air and made her heartbeat irregular. For a moment, the world outside the office ceased to exist. There was only the two of them, the quiet tension of proximity, and the unspoken awareness that this encounter was anything but ordinary. In that instant, she realized that the professional boundaries she had relied upon were fragile at best. His presence was a test, a temptation, and an invitation all at once, and she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to resist. The knock on the door was soft, almost tentative, but it echoed in her quiet apartment like a herald of something inevitable. She had been expecting the mail, a delivery, maybe a friend dropping by, but certainly not him. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened the door, and there he was, standing in the threshold like he belonged there, as if the universe had arranged this exact moment. The late afternoon light from the hallway behind him cast long shadows, highlighting the sharp lines of his face and the effortless elegance of his tailored jacket. He smiled at her, that same disarming, confident smile she had seen only once before in the office. It carried a subtle warmth, a charm that felt both familiar and forbidden. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, his voice smooth, rich, and slightly teasing, the kind of tone that made it impossible not to be drawn in. She found herself fumbling for words, unsure how to respond. Her mind raced, questions, warnings, and curiosity all tangled together. The living room behind him was bathed in golden sunlight, revealing glimpses of her life. The carefully arranged books on the shelf, the small potted plant by the window, the photograph she had framed on the side table. And yet, all of it seemed to fade into the background. Her attention was entirely on him, on the way he leaned casually against the doorframe, one hand resting lightly on the wood, the other holding a small folder that seemed almost incidental compared to the intensity of his presence. She stepped aside, silently inviting him in, though part of her hesitated. There was something electric in the air, a charged tension that made her pulse quicken and her thoughts scatter. He moved forward with a natural grace, his gaze sweeping over the room in a way that suggested familiarity and confidence, though she knew he had never been there before. It was as if he belonged to this space now, just as he seemed to belong in her thoughts. He set the folder down on the coffee table and turned to her, his eyes locking onto hers with a subtle intensity. "I thought I'd come by to discuss a few things about your work," he said, but there was a hint of something unsaid in his tone, a hidden layer that made her stomach flutter. She nodded, unable to speak immediately, caught in the magnetic pull of his presence. Every detail, the tilt of his head, the way his jacket fell perfectly over broad shoulders, the faint scent of his cologne, seemed to command her attention. For a moment, words were unnecessary. The silence was filled with unspoken understanding and a shared history she hadn't lived but felt keenly through the stories of her late boss. The man who had been her mentor's closest friend was now here, standing inches away, blurring the line between professional respect and personal temptation. She realized, with an almost shocking clarity, that this encounter wasn't just a chance meeting. It was the beginning of a tension that would test her boundaries and awaken feelings she hadn't expected, and perhaps didn't want to resist. The conference room was quiet, the low murmur of the city outside seeping through the glass walls. She sat at the head of the table, neatly arranged folders and a steaming cup of coffee before her, trying to focus on the stack of reports. But she couldn't, not with him sitting across from her, just a few feet away, observing her with a calm, confident air. It wasn't overt, nothing that would seem inappropriate in a professional setting, yet the intensity of his gaze made her pulse skip in ways she hadn't anticipated. He leaned back slightly in his chair, one arm casually draped over the backrest, his posture relaxed but commanding. His eyes, dark and intelligent, found hers across the table. There was a playful glint there, subtle but unmistakable, a silent invitation she felt too acutely in her chest. For a moment, their eyes locked, and the world seemed to shrink around them. The papers, the folders, the coffee cup, all faded into the background, leaving only the electric tension between them. She felt heat rise to her cheeks, trying to maintain composure as she pretended to examine the report in front of her. She adjusted her glasses, took a deliberate sip of coffee, and tried to focus on the numbers, the charts, the mundane details of the work at hand. Yet every movement he made seemed amplified in her perception. The slight lean forward as he studied the document, the way his fingers tapped lightly on the polished wood of the table, the subtle curve of his lips as he glanced her way again. Each gesture was casual, but to her, it was charged with meaning, teasing and testing boundaries she hadn't realized were so fragile. The flirtation was unspoken, existing in glances and micro-expressions. She caught him smiling faintly, almost imperceptibly, as if he were aware of the effect he had on her. Her heartbeat quickened, but she told herself to stay professional. And yet, staying professional suddenly felt like a challenge she wasn't entirely committed to winning. There was a pull in his presence, a magnetism that drew her gaze back to him, despite her efforts to look elsewhere. He leaned in slightly, just enough to bridge the subtle gap between them without breaking the unspoken decorum. She noticed the scent of his cologne, warm and subtle, drifting across the table and enveloping her senses. Her fingers itched to brush against the papers again, to touch anything that brought her closer to him, but she restrained herself. And still, the moment lingered, heavy with possibility and the delicious tension of something that was both forbidden and intoxicating. Their eyes met once more, and in that brief connection, she felt an unspoken understanding. Words weren't necessary. The flirtatious glance conveyed everything: the curiosity, the intrigue, the temptation, and the dangerous thrill of the unknown. It was a silent conversation, a delicate dance across the polished surface of the table, and she realized that this was just the beginning of an encounter that would test the limits of her composure, her desires, and her resolve. The office was cloaked in the quiet solitude of late evening. The hum of the air conditioning and the distant traffic outside were the only sounds that accompanied her as she sifted through the remaining paperwork on her desk. The city lights flickered through the large windows, casting long, golden reflections across the polished floor and creating a cinematic glow that seemed almost unreal. She was alone, or at least, she thought she was, until a soft voice broke the stillness. He was there, leaning casually against the edge of her desk, the dim lamplight highlighting the strong lines of his face. The tailored suit he wore earlier in the day had been replaced with a more relaxed jacket, sleeves rolled up, giving him an approachable yet undeniably magnetic presence. His eyes held that same sharp intensity she had seen before, now softened slightly by the intimacy of the quiet office. He extended a folder toward her, but it was not the contents that drew her attention. It was the way his fingers brushed hers as she accepted it, sending a small, electric thrill racing through her. "Working late again?" he asked, his voice smooth, low, and tinged with amusement. She hesitated before answering, trying to maintain a professional tone, yet her words stumbled slightly, betraying the awareness of his presence. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and unspoken, and it was impossible not to notice. His closeness, the subtle scent of cedar and warmth that accompanied him, and the way the soft lamplight danced across his features. It was overwhelming, intoxicating even. He stepped closer under the pretense of looking at the documents. Yet every movement seemed deliberate, drawing her attention to him in a way that was impossible to ignore. Her eyes caught the curve of his jaw, the faint shadow under his eyes from a long day, and the calm confidence that seemed to radiate from him effortlessly. Every subtle gesture, the brush of his hand against hers again, the way he leaned slightly, felt charged with an energy that blurred the lines between professional boundaries and personal temptation. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The office around them, the papers, the monitors, the quiet hum of fluorescent lights, vanished into the background. There was only the magnetic pull between them, a silent dance of proximity, awareness, and unspoken desire. She realized how dangerous it was to be alone with him in this intimate setting. Yet the thrill of it made her pulse quicken. Every glance, every movement, carried a weight of possibility she had not anticipated, a tension that left her both nervous and exhilarated. Finally, he straightened, offering a faint smile that seemed to acknowledge the charged atmosphere without saying a word. "I'll leave you to finish," he murmured, but the way he lingered near the doorway suggested otherwise. She watched him go, feeling an unexpected mix of relief and longing. Even in his absence, the tension remained, a silent reminder that this late-night encounter was just one of many moments where boundaries might blur and temptation would quietly, persistently, pull her closer. The balcony overlooked the city as dusk settled in, painting the skyline in shades of deep orange and fading purple. The lights of the buildings blinked on one by one, creating a soft, sparkling mosaic that seemed almost magical. She leaned lightly against the railing, the cool metal pressing against her palms, her thoughts swirling in a mixture of anticipation and hesitation. She hadn't expected him to be here, or for her heart to react this way, but there he was, casually perched on the edge of the balcony, radiating that effortless confidence she couldn't ignore. He glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips, and the subtle tilt of his head sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. "You seem lost in thought," he remarked, his voice smooth and teasing, just enough to make her pulse quicken. She looked away, pretending to focus on the city lights, but she could feel his eyes on her, studying her reactions, reading her like an open book. Every glance from him carried weight. Every movement seemed deliberate, and she was acutely aware of the tension simmering between them. The balcony was a private world, a little sanctuary above the bustling streets below, yet it felt charged with possibility. He leaned on the railing beside her, close enough that she could sense the warmth radiating from him, the faint scent of his cologne, a mix of cedarwood and subtle spice, drifting through the cool evening air. Her hands tightened slightly on the railing, and she told herself to stay composed, to resist the magnetic pull that seemed to draw her nearer with every heartbeat. He gestured casually toward the skyline, pointing out distant landmarks with an ease that made him seem relaxed, Yet every subtle motion, the brush of his sleeve, the way his shoulders moved, the casual confidence in his stance, was impossibly attractive. She caught herself watching him more than the city, noticing details she hadn't before. The faint creases at the corners of his eyes when he smiled, the way his jacket fit perfectly over his broad shoulders, the slow, deliberate way he shifted his weight. Each small observation heightened the tension, a delicate dance between fascination and restraint. Their conversation was light, almost playful, a gentle tease that masked the undercurrent of desire that neither of them fully acknowledged. Yet in the silence between words, in the moments when their eyes met, the casualness of his presence became something far more intimate. She realized that the temptation wasn't just in his looks or charm. It was in the way he made her feel, noticed, wanted, and quietly unraveled by the subtle, unspoken connection between them. As the evening deepened, shadows stretching across the balcony floor, she understood that this was no ordinary encounter. Every laugh, every glance, every subtle brush of proximity carried an unspoken promise, a quiet tension that hinted at what could be if boundaries were crossed. And despite her best efforts to maintain distance, she couldn't deny the thrill, the pull, and the undeniable temptation that had taken hold of her entirely. She paused at the slightly ajar office door, intending only to glance inside before retreating to finish her work. The space was quiet, the soft hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound, yet she immediately sensed that she wasn't alone. And there he was, standing by the desk, his posture casual but somehow impossibly commanding. She froze for a moment, caught by the subtle curve of his lips, a smile that seemed both private and deliberately teasing. It was a secret smile, one meant for her eyes only, and it had the power to make her heartbeat quicken without a single word being spoken. He didn't move immediately, allowing her to take in the scene, as if inviting her into a moment she didn't fully understand but felt compelled to enter. The sunlight from the window behind him highlighted the strong contours of his face, casting soft shadows that made him look both approachable and untouchable at the same time. His eyes met hers across the room, and in that brief connection, a subtle tension flickered, charged with unspoken meaning. She wanted to look away, to remind herself that he was her late boss's closest friend, that boundaries existed. But the secret smile held her in place, magnetic and impossible to resist. He stepped slightly closer, the quiet rhythm of his movements measured and confident. She noticed the gentle rise and fall of his shoulders, the faint scent of his cologne mingling with the crisp air of the office. He made no overt gesture, yet the air between them seemed charged, every micro-movement filled with significance. It wasn't just his appearance. It was the way he existed in the room, as though he had the ability to command attention without demanding it. The smile remained, a delicate promise hidden in plain sight, daring her to notice, to respond. She shifted slightly, brushing her hand over the desk to steady herself, pretending to focus on the papers before her. But her eyes kept returning to him, tracing the lines of his jaw, the calm confidence in his stance, and that smile that seemed to carry stories, secrets, and intentions she wasn't supposed to know. Each glance was a silent conversation, a gentle pull at boundaries, an invitation she hadn't agreed to but felt incapable of resisting. The secret smile was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but for her, it was everything. A spark of intimacy, a tease of desire, and a reminder that the ordinary rules didn't seem to apply when he was near. Time seemed to stretch, the quiet office amplifying the charged atmosphere. Words were unnecessary. The exchange was entirely in glances and gestures, each moment layering tension upon tension. She realized, with a thrill that bordered on fear, that she was being drawn in deeper than she had intended. His secret smile was no longer just a gesture. It was a challenge, a temptation, and an unspoken acknowledgement of the delicate, irresistible tension building between them. As he finally turned to retrieve a file and move away, the smile lingered in her mind, a memory that would echo long after he left the room. It was a reminder that some encounters didn't require words to leave an indelible mark, and that temptation could be as simple and as powerful as a glance. Coffee encounter the cafe was cozy, the warm aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the soft chatter of a few late afternoon patrons. She had chosen a small corner table by the window, thinking it would give her a quiet moment to organize her thoughts. But as she looked up, her plans unraveled completely. There he was, leaning casually against the counter, scanning the menu with an ease that was effortlessly magnetic. The instant she saw him, her chest tightened in a way that was both thrilling and unnerving. He caught her gaze immediately, and that subtle, disarming smile she had come to know so well appeared. It wasn't just a smile. It was a recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of the connection that had been simmering since their first meeting. Without hesitation, he walked over, his movements deliberate yet unhurried, the faint scent of his cologne preceding him and wrapping around her senses like a warm embrace. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice smooth and teasing, carrying a weight that made her heart skip. She managed a nod, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup as he pulled out the chair opposite her and settled in, close enough that the air between them felt almost tangible. The interaction was casual on the surface, ordering coffee, exchanging polite, small talk, but beneath it simmered a tension that neither of them could entirely mask. He handed her the cup with a slight brush of fingers, a fleeting touch that sent an unexpected jolt through her. She quickly sipped her coffee, pretending to focus on the warmth of the cup, yet her awareness of him was all-consuming. Every gesture he made, the tilt of his head, the subtle lean forward as he spoke, the easy, confident way he settled into the chair, was loaded with unspoken meaning. She noticed details she hadn't before. The way his eyes lingered for just a moment too long, the slight curve of his lips when he glanced her way, the warmth in his tone that seemed to speak directly to her, bypassing the usual niceties of conversation. Even in a casual cafe setting, he had a way of making the ordinary feel charged, turning the simple act of sharing coffee into an intimate, almost electric experience. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The ambient noise of the cafe faded into the background, leaving only the quiet rhythm of their shared space, the soft clink of cups, the murmur of conversation, and the subtle heartbeat of attraction between them. She realized, with both excitement and apprehension, that this encounter was no coincidence. The proximity, the gentle touches, the playful glances, they all combined to blur the line between casual and intimate, professional restraint and personal temptation. As he finally leaned back, giving her a teasing grin and a wink that spoke volumes, she felt the thrill of anticipation course through her. This was no ordinary coffee break. It was a moment that would linger in her mind long after the cups were empty, a subtle yet undeniable confirmation that temptation was never far away when he was near. And even as she sipped her coffee, trying to regain composure, she knew that this encounter was only the beginning of something far more compelling and dangerously alluring.